Very pleased to welcome Adam Oliver here today. Adam is always around here. He's been here around here since 2001. You might think of it, Adam's got a sort of two-part career. He started off doing a lot of health economics and health policy, and then he transitioned his focus into behavioural economics, with a U, behavioural, and a related area in which he's leading the development of the field, namely behavioural public policy. And as you'll see, he's an engaging enthusiast for this area. By leading developments, he's got lots of publications, articles and books, but also disciplinary service in the sense of initiating and organising various seminar series. You will have received his emails. And he also edits journals. So like in the two-part career, he started off and is editor-in-chief of Health Economics Policy and the Law. And more recent initiative is behavioural public policy, both of those coming out from Cambridge University Press. In particular, what distinguishes what Adam's been doing recently is what can think of as a trilogy of books around his behavioural public policy ideas, and he's put the pictures up there. First one, 2017, The Origins of Behavioural Public Policy. Second, Reciprocity, 2019. And we're coming up to the forthcoming publication of this one, which he's going to tell us about today. What he has to also tell us about is what the cover art is going to be. See, the behavioural and policy stuff is in the pictures, but so what would be in the...
I'll tell you that in a minute.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so we're going to hear so big ideas, big developments here. And we're, I think it's only a trilogy, right? There's not a,
I hope so.
Not a,
move on to a
prequel or a post-score. But anyway, thank you very much, Adam.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Stephen. I think Stephen's covered half of my talk already, so it's not short of that. But I planned it today. I mean, Stephen mentioned that I had a two-part career. I don't quite see it like that myself, because I did my PhD in behavioural economics and then worked. As I came into the LSE, I did behavioural economics as applied to health. And people in the LSE encouraged me to do some health policy in the early 2000s. But I was doing that beside my behavioural economics stuff. So when behavioural public policy, or what is now known as behavioural public policy, became a thing about 2008, I'd always kind of been doing that, mostly in relation to health, but it didn't require a big jump of the imagination to broaden that out to public policy generally. So I think I've been around this area, for a long time before behavioural public policy became a field in its own right. So behavioural public policy is, I think it can be defined as the application of behavioural science, or the findings from behavioural science, to the design of public policy, public policy interventions, institutions. So it's quite broad. It's very, very multidisciplinary. And believe it or not, and this is true, the Social Policy Department and the LSE generally are amongst the leading institutions and departments in the world in this area, because we have so much that's coming out of this department that serves the infrastructure of this whole new field or subfield of public policy. So Stephen mentioned, we've got the journal, probably the leading field journal in behavioural policy, called Behavioural Policy, international. The annual International Behavioural Public Policy Conference, leading conference in the area, I think. The International Behavioural Public Policy Association, it's the leading field association. So what part of my task is today is to convince you all, that this is a thing in this department that's important, I think, an important niche, not just for the department, but for the LSE generally. And to also indicate to you that although you've probably not really thought about it, a lot of you are doing research that's probably intimately related to this general field anyway, but you just don't know it yet. So maybe, so as Stephen said, one of the efforts that I've tried to put in over the last 3 years is to provide this kind of trilogy of books for Cambridge University Press on the origins, the development, and to some extent, the future of behavioural public policy as a field. That's what I've been trying to do. At the moment, there's no overarching political economy, I don't think, behavioural public policy. And I've been trying to produce one of those. Obviously, it's probably further work into the future. This is something that needs to be worked upon probably for many, many years. I've tried to make a start on it. So as you can see, the first book in the trilogy was The Origins of Behavioural Public Policy. I tried to think of a title that was kind of similar to The Origins of the Species, because if I think of a title that's similar, it'll just go down. It's a great look in the history of intellectual. And the inspiration for this actually was in Darwin's notebooks. He scribbles a lot of sort of tree diagrams on the tree of life. So that was the hidden, what do you call it, the relevance, hidden relevance, I suppose, for that diagram there. Reciprocity in the art of behavioural public policy. I was trying to think of a really big seller. So I was thinking, Zen and the arts of motorcycle maintenance, which sold millions and millions of copies. And so I thought, call it something like that, so millions of copies, right? So this is the notion of reciprocity. In standard rational choice theory, the general caricature is that people are egoistic, very, very selfishly egoistic. And people have responded to that, saying, no, people are often altruistic, purely altruistic. I think they're somewhere in between most of the time. They're not unconditional takers or unconditional givers. They're conditional givers and conditioned takers. So I think that reciprocity is very, very important human motivation, fundamental human motivation that evolved for good reasons. It holds societies together, and if it holds societies together, then it's generally good for the individuals that belong to those societies. So reciprocity is sometimes called the golden rule, holding everything else together. So that's why I chose this particular picture for the cover there. And then the final book, Political Economy of Behavioural Public Policy. My inspiration for that title was J.S. Mill's Principles of Political Economy. And the cover, thanks for this, Stephen, but the cover will be, if you've ever read Mill, it uses a lot of horticultural analogies, metaphors, to illustrate his arguments. And he uses the word flourishing a lot around flourishing gardens and relates that to a flourishing life. So the picture, I think, I haven't seen it yet, but the picture is going to be kind of a flourishing tree, because that's one of the essences of the book. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is some of the arguments, not all of the arguments, of course, because I'm only going to speak for 40 minutes or so, but just some of the main arguments that I've tried to make in this trilogy, really, I suppose, but with a particular emphasis towards the middle of this talk about the arguments that I've come up with in terms of developing a new political economy and behavioural public policy. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, in behavioural public policy, which, as I said, it's kind of probably as a subfield as a distinct subfield of public policy, it's probably, I'd say, about 12, 14 years old now. People were doing what is known as behavioural public policy before that. There's a sort of distinct subfield in its own right. And I don't know if you know this, but the term behavioural public policy actually was invented at the LSE. And it was invented in a teaching committee where Julian Legrand was trying to think of a new word for a course that he was thinking about developing in 2010, which became behavioural public policy. So that's I think where the term came from. And the catalyst really for this new subfield was there was a number of things that kind of happened at the same time. There was the huge financials crisis, do you remember, in 2008, where standard economic theory came under the microscope and people were looking for sort of alternatives, and behavioural economics for a time was very, very prominent in those considerations. So application of behavioural economics, behavioural science, public policy became important there. Running alongside that, of that sort of financial crisis, governments all of a sudden started to look for what they thought would be quite cheap, inexpensive solutions to public policy problems, because all of a sudden they didn't have any money. And they latched onto a book called Nudge. Well, subtitle is, what's the main title of the book? Nudge. Yeah, the main title of the book was Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. They've been working on these ideas for a few years. They had I think it was an American Economic Review journal article in 2003 on it. But this was the big popular. This was the popular push for their particular approach that caught the imagination of many, many people, including the leader of the opposition at that time, David Cameron. When he became Prime Minister, one of his first actions was to set up a behavioural insights team in part of the UK government. So I think that these sort of various circumstances kind of happened at the same time, and they led to the development of this whole new field. Now, Thaler and Sunstein's approach, their sort of conceptual approach, is called asymmetric. Sorry, it's not. It's called libertarian paternalism. There is another one similar called asymmetric paternalism. Theirs is called libertarian paternalism. And when I read their work, and I've read it many, many times, it seems to me as though they were proposing nudge interventions as applications of libertarian paternalism. And ever since that time, I mean, I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have heard of the word nudge in this context. That has been the dominant approach in the development of behavioural public policy. So I just want you to take through what I see as the main requirements for a policy intervention to be called a nudge intervention. And I'm going to argue, from my own perspective, that that's not the most appropriate way to take the field forward. But I'll argue that in a moment. So it's called libertarian paternalism. Sounds like an oxymoron, but they've always argued that they are presenting a form of what's called soft paternalism. So they're not forcing people to change their behaviours, but they're providing conditions that might motivate people to change their behaviours according to those individuals' preferences themselves. It's very, philosophically, it's actually a very controversial statement to say that, but that's what they're proposing. So the original nudge requirements, firstly, it should target what's called internalities. This is the paternalistic arm, right? So it's not, in its libertarian paternalism form, it's not targeting externalities. So if I'm the policymaker and I'm trying to introduce a nudge, I'm not saying to Stephen, you've got to change your behaviour because if you do so, that will be for your own good. That would be the internality of it. Right? That's what they are arguing. That would be the internality of it. So it's not saying, Stephen, you've got to change your behaviour because you're harming Becca. Right? Because I'm sure he often does that anyway, but that would be the externality argument. That would be the externality. That's not what they were getting at with it. Can't be, because it's libertarian paternalism. Right? Paternalism is an internality argument. So they should be focusing on internalities, paternalistic. It should be liberty preserving. If it's not liberty preserving, then it's not libertarian paternalism, is it? Right? So it's a soft form of paternalism. So if people are doing something that is considered to be bad for them, individuals themselves, say they smoke, a nudge intervention will not prevent that person from continuing to smoke if they wish to do so. It's just trying to motivate them in some way to stop smoking. So it preserves liberty in that sense. Right? It shouldn't involve overt persuasion or education or information, because that's focusing on an individual agency. It's trying to openly persuade people that they're doing something bad or good, or they should be doing something good. Right? Now, what Thaler himself argued is that you're not, with nudges, you're not trying to change people's views about things openly, openly educate them. You're trying to go with the grain of how they form their decisions anyway, their automatic decisions on a day-to-day basis. So it's trying to feed into these, and I'll talk about these a little bit in a moment, these deep cognitive affects that guide all of us, probably, or most of us, when we make our automatic decisions on a day-to-day basis. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. It's not saying that these things are necessarily bad, but for a nudge, for a policy intervention to be a nudge, these are the requirements. It shouldn't involve any large financial incentives. If it involves large financial incentives, it's a tool of standard economic theory. It's called the relative price mechanism. One of the most basic principles of standard economic theory. You pay somebody to do something, you're more likely to do it. Less likely to do it. So it's not trying to use large financial incentives. There may be a case where you can use very small financial incentives. If it has a big effect, that there could be something more than the financial incentive going on. Think about the small charge for plastic bag use. It has a huge effect. Seems to be something more going on than just a sort of material disincentive. Of course, in order for it to be part of behavioural public policy, I think, it should be informed by the findings of behavioural science or behavioural economics somewhere. So, I mean, if you read the literature, you'll see, I'm just going to say this. You'll see that
there was no overt persuasion, by the way. I just try to change the choice environment by getting you to warm up. And
This will be the limit. I've just done so you'll see in the literature, you'll see that there's potentially sometimes hundreds of these behavioural affects listed. But if you really look at them, a lot of the times their same affect is given a different name. Sometimes these things are not very robust either. So I'd say there's about 10 or 12 really robust behavioural science phenomena. So one of them, and this might seem common sense to you, but one of them is commonly called present bias. So that is the observation that people put in, sometimes called a hyperbolic discounting, put an enormous weight on the immediate moment. I think it could be related to salience as well, which I'll come back to. An enormous weight on the immediate moment, very, very heavily, quickly discount future moments. So that's been put forward as a possible explanation for why people might smoke, or might drink too much alcohol, or might not save enough for their retirements, or not be considerate enough towards the environment. If in the immediate moment something is reasonably inconvenient or slightly painful to do, even though it has good long-term future consequences, people might not do it. Another one is loss aversion, very common observation in the literature, quite robust. This is the observation that people attach more disutility or more pain to losing a particular thing than they do utility or joy of gaining that same thing. So if you think about it, if you were to lose £10, or unless you're paid as much as Stephen, you probably don't care about losing £10, do you, Stephen? But if you were to lose £10, right, that would cause you a degree of pain, wouldn't it? Right? If you were to find £10 in the street, you'd feel a sense of joy. In standard economic theory, monetary amounts of that amount, the pain and the joy should be roughly seen similar magnitude, very, very similar magnitude. But what they found is that people care much more about losing that thing than gaining the same thing by about twice as much in terms of the similar magnitude. So that's called loss aversion. Right? I'm not going to talk about all of it. That's just giving you some examples. A couple of examples. Another one could be the social norm effects that Tim talked about last week as well. That's a broader behavioural science, I think, rather than a behavioural economics phenomenon. Very, very powerful and used increasingly. Injunctive norms, get people to feel guilty about doing things. And they might be more likely, or less likely in that case to do that particular thing. That might be what is happening partially in the plastic bag case. You're getting people to feel guilty by charging them about using plastic bag in the immediate moment. So there could be a number of things going on. Anyway, what Thaler and Sunstein and others have argued is that these behavioural economic phenomena or behavioural science phenomena, you can almost consider them as affects or rules of thumb, guide individual behaviours. Without individuals even think about it that much or at all, just the way we make decisions. Right? Most of the time that serves us okay. As we go through our lives on a daily basis, you make hundreds of decisions, most of them you're not even thinking about, and you just make them. And these rules of thumb are guiding your decisions, and most of the time that's okay. But sometimes they argue that these behavioural affects can lead you to make automatic decisions that, if you thought about it deliberatively, you'd prefer not to make. Right? So what they say with this nudge approach is that we should be changing people's environment, what they call their choice architecture, in some such that people are more likely to make automatic choices, unreflective choices, that better align with deliberatively what they really prefer to do. So, classic example that people roll out all the time. Sometimes, classic examples get rolled out all the time because there's not many other examples you can think about, right? So you hear the same things over and over again. Is that if you reorder desserts on the LSE canteen dessert counter, so if you put apples on the dessert counter at the front of the counter and leave cheesecake or whatever it is at the back, automatically people might choose more apples than cheesecake than they otherwise would. They're still free. They're still free to choose the cheesecake if they want to. It's a soft form of paternalism. But because of salience, maybe present bias to some extent, they're more likely to choose the healthier option. And if that is consistent with deliberatively what they really want to do, It's targeting really their internalities. They'd rather choose, if they thought about it, healthy desert, and it's consistent with, I think, possessing all of the characteristics of a nudge intervention. So that's what they're saying. Okay. Now, I think this is, I don't agree with it. It's not my cup of tea. No, I'm not a paternalist. But I do think it was a novel and intellectually coherent approach. I can see that. You know, if you can agree with that, you can believe in that. That's fine. It seems to me to be well worked out. And at the time, novel. In the intervening years, now you see you read things and almost anything is labelled a nudge these days. You know, I've seen income tax labelled as a nudge. It's things that the antithesis of these characteristics really are being labelled as nudge interventions. And this is not helped by, I don't think, by the word nudge being qualified with the affixation of various terms in the literature. So you see interventions described as educational nudges, and you look at them, they're not nudges, they're forms of education. You're trying to improve explicitly and openly individual agency. You're openly educating, something that John Stuart Mill himself was very, very strongly supportive of course, because presumably, since we all work in a university, we're supportive of as well, right? Informational nudges, they're just pieces of information. Calorie counts on language, you give people information. Can't see much behavioural science in that. Not to me, they're not tools of behavioural public policy. They're good, possibly, but they're not nudges, it seems to me. And then you see nudges being described as social nudges and green nudges, and these green nudges are focused upon the environment. These are interventions, when you look at them, that are explicitly targeting externalities. They're not targeting internalities. They're not forms of paternalism at all, in many instances. They're perfectly legitimate, but perfectly consistent with the liberal framework that I'll talk about in a moment. So I think that this has created a whole lot of intellectual messiness that has served the discipline, or this new subfield, all over the years. It's become a very confused area. And what I've been trying to do is provide a degree of intellectual clarity to this whole thing. Now, I think that this widening of the range of interventions beyond the original nudge is explainable. Of course it is, because if you think about nudges, they're quite limiting, really. If you were to stick to all of these characteristics, you're not going to come up with many problems that really tackle the major challenges that contemporary societies face. And on top of that, you might meet quite strong resistance from the population as well. This is related to something Tim talked about last week in terms of smoking. When smoking cessation policies became really effective, it's not when they were saying, you need to change your behaviour because that's not good for you. It became more effective when people started saying, you need to change your behaviour because you're harming other people. The externality of it. So it's explainable because I think that they gradually realised, probably by osmosis or not even thinking about it that much, is that that you're only really going to develop good behavioural interventions, I think, or effective behavioural interventions if you go beyond the original requirements. I think that's what's all openly sort of widened out. So I've said there, this loose labelling to me has led to a lot of loss of intellectual clarity. If you say to me, and you had this very loose labelling, do you support nudge policies? I wouldn't know how to answer that, because there'd be some aspects in terms of externalities that I would support, but certainly I personally wouldn't support the paternalistic on that approach. Now, where does that leave me then as a non-paternalist who's also likes to think of himself as a behavioural economist? If this approach of libertarian paternalism and other soft forms of paternalism have dominated the development of the field, where does that leave me? Is there a role for me? Luckily, there is a role for me. And I would say it's an more important role for people like me than the people that it's the paternalistic on. Right? So there are distinct non-paternalistic forms of behavioural public policy. So just to take stock in a moment, and I'll talk about both of these a little bit more in a second, just to take stock of where we are. When we think about this a little bit more, let's think about it in a bit more detail, right? Are the assumptions underlying behavioural paternalism valid? Behavioural paternalism, soft forms of paternalism. Are they valid? So what they're assuming is that people, when they are guided by these affects, these behavioural economic phenomena, behavioural science phenomena, they're making mistakes and errors in their decision making all of the time. Is that assumption valid? Let's come on to that in a second. And can behavioural public policy then fit within a more liberal framework? And there's movements in this direction. Bob Sugden wrote a book a few years ago called The Community of Advantage. And I think Bob's book is the only other really overarching behavioural public policy framework, I think, overarching framework. But Bob is somebody that sort of fits with it. His heroes are really Smith and Hume, I think, but he sort of fits within the Austrian school of economics line, I think, Bob, in that he doesn't really have much truck with externalities. She thinks that, you can let people get on with it, and that's the best way to secure social cooperation, which I kind of support as well, but I recognise the importance of externalities I'll talk about in a moment. Bob, not so much. Mario Rizzo and Glenn Whitman, they wrote a book called Escaping Paternalism. So they provide a lot of these criticisms against some forms of paternalism, but they don't really come up with an overarching framework, an alternative. Whereas I like to think that in my new book, I do. So, what's the liberal challenge then to behavioural paternalism? I'm just going to talk for a second about those 2 points I made. Do people necessarily, deliberately, seek to maximise an outcomes-based concept of welfare? I'm guessing that a lot of you are welfarists, so you'd say yes, they do, right? But I don't think so. Right? I don't think for most of our decisions we really sit down and think beforehand, ex ante, what's going to maximise my welfare or my happiness or my utility from this decision, and then follow that which most is likely to do that. Otherwise, none of you would be sitting here today, would you? I think we have desires that are difficult for us to explain. And we do them, we just follow them in some sense. And in some instances, we do think about the utility and the happiness that comes from it, but not all the time. Not all the time. Not all the time is that important. When we keep a promise, it's like an instinctive thing to do for most of us, I think. I like to think most of us. But it might not maximise your happiness or your outcomes in any sense. I'm not alone in thinking this. Bertrand Russell adopted this line of thinking as well. So if that's the case, if desires are antecedent to any consideration of outcomes in most cases, why is it necessarily the case that these behavioural phenomena, these behavioural affects are causing us to make errors? It might be helping us towards those actions that we really want to do. Now, I was going to say a bit more about that. So, just to make this clear, right? In the sort of standard rational choice theory approach, it's assumed that people, generally it's assumed as a caricature, that people ought to maximise their outcomes-based concept of welfare or utility in some sense. And they will make choices that generally do. The behavioural economists came up, and that most of them said, well, people don't make those choices in those ways a lot of the time. They make systematic errors. They ought to be maximising their utility or their happiness or their welfare. Often then they follow particular rules or heuristics that lead them in other directions. And therefore, they must be making errors. Why? I mean, why do we do that? These things lie so deep within the human breast. Present bias, loss of learning, social norm effects, so deep within the human breast. Observed in a multitude of different cultures. Observed in other species, often. Why are they there then? Why haven't they been selected against over the many, many thousands of years that they've been evolving? Now, I think the mistake of behavioural economists was not to continue to assume that the appropriate normative criteria was outcomes-based maximisation, and then to assume, that the actual action, the decisions are errors. What I think we should have done is relax that normative assumption and recognise that people, all of us, have multifarious desires that we wish to follow in our own lives that vary not just across each of us, but vary within each of us, depending upon context as well. Now, for standard economic theory and standard rational choice theory, and actually for behavioral economics, or most of behavioral economics, it's assumed that these inconsistencies are errors. So I'll give you a basic one, right? A very basic one. Standard rational choice theory assumes that people should have a consistent risk attitude across choices. Generally, risk neutrality, but for large outcomes, mild risk aversion. I won't go on about that. A consistent risk attitude. But you know, I think, that many people engage in both risky choices and risk-averse behaviours as well. People play the game. The same person will play the lottery, for instance, risk-seeking choice, and will insure themselves against various hazards in life, a risk-averse choice. What's wrong with that? The gamble, as long as it's done responsibly, responsible gambling, may enrich your life. You know, adds a bit of fun, a bit of diversion, one's daily existence. The promise that you might be able to resign your position if you don't like your boss. All that sort of stuff. What are you looking at? Sleeping again?
I'm looking at Lucinda.
But then also they want that same person wants to insure themselves against potentially catastrophic circumstances. Nothing wrong with inconsistent choices as far as I can see, across different contexts. As long as you don't assume that people want to always maximize their outcome-based concepts of utility. So I think it's okay for people to be consistent. The desires to be context dependent. If that's the case, then as long as people are not harming other people, as long as we're just thinking about paternalism, as long as they're not harming other people, just let them get on with it. They might be following those actions, for all we know, that match their desires. So, just my final slide, I think. Where does that leave me then? Because I'm saying that, going back to what I said a moment ago, I'm saying that just let people go on, get on with their lives, let them do what they want. Where does that leave me as a behavioural policy analyst? I'm not saying exactly leave them completely to do what they want, because if they're harming others, I'm saying we should do something about that. Right? So I believe that we should be affording people a great deal of autonomy over their own lives, not so worrying so much whether the individual is maximising their utility. They might have desires they're following, that's up to them. There's a third party, a policymaker. They can understand that better than I can. Right? But even though these behavioural affects may have evolved for good reason, it may be that in modern societies, I'm talking the last 150 years or so, many people or organisations have learned that by using these behavioural affects, even if they haven't, termed them present bias or loss aversion or whatever, they've learned how to use them to manipulate the people. Right? So you can think about this in a classic exchange relationship. You can think about economic relationships between the buyer and the seller. It could be all sorts of exchange relationships, but let's just consider the buyer and the seller. Right? We know that I think we know that many instances, a supplier will implicitly or sometimes explicitly use the behavioural influences out of self-interest to manipulate somebody else, i.e. the people purchasing their services or goods, to buy more of those services or goods. Let's think about a stark example of payday loan companies. It might be that the payday loan companies, if you leave them alone, will emphasize the joys of spending money, borrowing money, but underplay the negative implications of having to pay that money back. Maybe disguising, or in some cases not even uncovering at all, the interest rates that people find very, very difficult to process anyway. That, I think, is a form of behavioural-informed externality. It's one party using the behavioural influences to impose harms upon another party. And if that happens, I'm not saying we should definitely regulate against that activity in all circumstances, but there's an intellectual justification for considering that we might regulate against that externality, against that manipulation, from a liberal perspective, right? i.e. a J.S. Millian perspective. Not necessarily an Austrian School of Economics perspective, but certainly from a J.S. Millian liberal perspective. That's where I would use behavioural information. to inform policy design. And I've called those, for many years now, those types of interventions, I've called them budgets. I think I came up with that idea, the term budget, years and years ago, when I was fishing with Tim, you probably remember Tim. I was fishing with Tim about what to call them. I was thinking of a catchy term again, because of my behavioural angle, nudge, became massively popular and influential. Just call it budge and it'd be equally popular. So that's one arm where you can use. Another arm where I think you can use behavioural economics, behavioural science in a liberal framework, in my liberal million framework, is to improve individual agency. And this is associated with the work of Gigerenzer and Ralph Hertwig, who are both at the Max Planck Institute, I think. And they've come up with this notion of boosting. Right? There's two arms of boosting. One arm of boosting, which I've been trying to do for many years, I suppose, without realizing it, is to try to educate people about the behavioral influences, about present bias, about loss prevention, about social effects, about reciprocity, etc. So that if people are more cognitively aware of this, then maybe they are better able themselves to manage decisions where others might be using these influences to manipulate them, or even use them to manipulate their own choices themselves, right? If somebody is aware of present bias and that their decisions are heavily influenced by salience and present bias, and when they buy their weekly stash of chocolate chip cookies, they might put them at the back of the cupboard rather than on the front of the kitchen counter. So they're not always tuning them all the time. It's just a sort of trivial example. But I thought, what should I call examples that you can all relate to? Chocolate chips. Just now, actually. So forms of education. These are the other arm of boosting. Is that in the modern world, many decisions are so complex for people that even Nobel Prize winners, if you still value the Nobel Prize, can't process them. So in America, choosing your insurance plan or choosing a pension plan is very, very difficult for people to do. Or choosing some kind of medical, treatment plan can often be very, very difficult for people to process the decisions as they're framed to them, just because we haven't evolved to process that level of complexity in numerical figures and such like. So the other arm of boosting is to try to make those decisions more simplified for people, so that they're better able to make decisions that do accord with what they really want to do. That's a form of improving individual agency. So I think boosting is forms of education that is consistent with my liberal framework. And then finally, and I won't say much about this today because I wrote a whole book on this, on reciprocity. But to me, reciprocity is something that is a very basic human motivation that most people have the mental wiring to do, to behave reciprocally. And I think it evolved, and you see it in some of the species. I won't talk about examples today, but there's some of the species that also not just engage in attitudinal reciprocity, that is to say, cats licking each other instinctively. But sometimes some species do store memories and pay back either positively or negatively good and kind actions towards them. Now, I think that these things evolve, and David Hume argued this as well, because it's a form of self-interest. If you it's not a form of, it's often called reciprocal altruism, but I don't think it's a form of pure altruism at all. I think it's a form of self-interest, or more of an enlightened form of self-interest than selfish egoism. So you're good, or you're positive in your relationships with other people, because that will lead them to be positive in their relationships to you. So over the long term, that's good for the group, good for you as an individual. It's a form of what I call enlightened self-interest. But it can be crowded out. It can be very easily crowded out by the institutional environment, such that people start to behave more egoistically. And when they start to behave more egoistically, it's very difficult to claw it back again. They're very, very difficult to claw reciprocal behaviors back again. So this is something that the Austrians argue, that you need an institutional environment. When they're arguing about they support the free market, they qualify that. They say that we need institutions in place that allows the free market to function such that people behave in a socially cooperative way. So I think it feeds in with their arguments in the Austrian school. It's not just the JS Mill school. So that's where I think that we should be using the behavioural insights in policy. Regulate against externalities in the exchange relationship, to improve individual agency through what's called boosting, and to ensure that our institutional environments are not crowding out the deep reciprocal instincts that serve as well, that we demonstrate so positively these days in the Department of Social Policy. So overall, my jokes are going down as well as they usually do. I should give up. I say that every single presentation. I'm not going to joke anymore because I don't get a response. I'm dogging. So overall, compared to the soft paternalism that has dominated behavioural public policy to date, I would say that a liberal, and there's specifically a million, and it fits actually with David Hume as well, but a million framework, let people get on with their lives if they're not harming others. Start to think about, but educate them so that they can lead more flourishing lives. And if they start harming other people, then doing something about it. Is that not only more ethically defensible in these soft forms of paternalism, but it's potentially more useful in helping us address the major challenges that societies face? Thank you. Good.
Questions, folks? Reflections? Perhaps online. Hands up. So, Tony, from inside the framework.
So I've obviously mulled this quite a lot with them. I really like the framework you have there, but I wonder if there's one thing missing, which is part of this constitution is an honest approach to public policy. I think the concept of internalities would have fitted well in Mill's day, but in today's interconnected world,
You mean externalities?
Sorry?
You mean externalities or internalities?
Internalities, the idea that we could do something that has no spillover effect on society.
Oh.
I think everything is an externality.
Yeah.
And unless we accept that, we're not really being honest. And I think the pretense that there's this differentiation between internalities and externalities in a world with welfare states, and everything is in effect a social policy. Every decision we take has spillover effects on others. And there's this sort of basic honesty of what are we talking about when we're designing policies, and we can pretend it's for your benefit. We can, current example, we could give you information about how to save on your energy. And we look back at the level of government doing that. But the reason we're doing it is because we're scared of blackouts in society. And everything is an externality. And I just think it changes the conversation to accept the modern world.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that as well, and I agree. I agree that most things that we do as individuals, might have an effect on both as ourselves and on other people, on our families, for instance, in all sorts of ways. But for me, it's where the justification for a policy lies. So if we go back to Tim's argument again from last week, if they were introducing, say, smoking bans in public places, and the justification to me from them was that we're doing this because it's for your own good, then I wouldn't support that. If they did provide the justification, and it was a convincing justification, you're smoking and you're imposing passive smoking harms on other people in that place that are significant, and you provided that argument, and it was a convincing argument to me, then I could see that was an externality argument. That would be something that I would support. But on top of that, this argument that everything is an internality and an externality, it still remains the case that the dominant form of policy framework, partial frameworks within behavioural public policy over the last 15 years have been paternalistic ones. And it's come under a lot of criticism for that by people that argue we shouldn't be in favour of a nanny state, those sorts of things. To me, we can make stronger arguments in terms of using behavioural insights in public policy if we focus upon the externality arguments, if we demonstrate that there are significant externality arguments, in particular behaviours that are worth considering regulating against. So I think I'm kind of broadly
specific. And smoking in that case, the government chose to present it as an externality. And it's basically spin. And it's, do we choose this as an internality or an externality? How will it sell? And to me, that's fundamentally dishonest. The evidence on passive smoking is pretty slim compared to the evidence that it harms yourself and then it costs our healthcare system, which is really what's underlying.
Which might be slim as well. I mean,
it's
smoke,
that pick and choose.
So I agree. I agree with you, but I'm not responsible for what gets implemented. Right? I can only say that as an individual, for me personally, something would be more convincing as a policy intervention if it's described in terms of externalities and there's a strong argument underlying that particular proposal. Right? For me personally, then I would personally probably support it. Right? Just, it's often claimed that smokers impose costs on the NHS. That's, significant costs on the NHS. That's another reason for why these smoking bans, etc., have gone through. But there is evidence. I'm not sure if it's entirely convincing evidence, but there is some evidence that smokers impose less lifetime costs on the healthcare system than the non-smokers, because they die younger. Right? They die younger. They don't live through 20 years with their chronic illnesses. So that might be a bogus argument as well. I'm not saying that there's I'm just saying that in order to persuade.
Tim?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. I love your jokes. I was laughing. And it was a really great presentation. I buy in your argument that probably, I'll speak for myself, but I'm probably doing work that at least that could be well informed by behavioral public policy. So maybe it's not what it is, but it could be. So that's really exciting. I appreciate that. It just occurred to me as we we're talking about internalities and externalities, I immediately thought of masking. And I'm just curious about your reaction to, I think, especially in the American context, why the policies that were promoting masking largely failed, because they were very much about the externalities. It was like, don't mask for yourself, mask for other people. So I'm just curious what.
Yeah, I've written some about behavioral science in the pandemic. It's a tricky. It might be a culture, cross-cultural. Americans are not that different culture from us, are they? But there's sort of there does seem to be, at least in terms of the rhetoric, and greater emphasis on individual freedom and individual responsibility, etc., in the American context. Right? So it might be the case, if it's true that Americans didn't mask up so much as other nations, then they might have just resisted those particular arguments, because I do think that most of the pandemic response, the authoritarian pandemic response, most of it was focused upon externalities. So I think that again, as Tony says, there's internality and externality arguments in these sorts of things. For me, if it had been a pure internality argument, I would just try to educate people about the benefits and the risks of wearing masks, the spillover effects. If you mask, it might be the case that you don't socially distance as much as if you don't mask, right? So the evidence there is quite weak, actually, about whether these things are, they sound sensible in and of themselves, but when you think about all the unintended consequences, we still don't know an awful lot. But I think the main emphasis on mask wearing, on social distancing, even on hand washing, and then on getting your vaccine, is an externality focused argument. And that was the message underpinning the UK response, wasn't it? So, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. I think it's an externality focus. It wasn't like stay at home, protect yourself, save your own life, was it? It was more about like saving other people's lives. So I think there was a justification for authoritarianism in those sense. But always be careful about this creeping authoritarianism. But as we've seen, the population of this country have responded in against those measures quite quickly. In the American context, I'd have to know more about it, about why they're resisting. But the obvious explanation is that a lot of American students see themselves as more protective of their own individual agency and are less willing to buy externality arguments than people in other countries. Does that sound?
Yeah, no, like that. That speaks to the limitation of emphasis on externalities and where maybe this maybe the whole libertarian paternalism is more well suited for an American context where people are more sympathetic to Americans. I don't know.
Maybe I'd have to think about that. I would guess against that. I would say that it's probably going to have to be a more I would thought if people are resistant to those messages, then you have to adopt a more authoritarian response. That's kind of what happened here. Initially, they were relying on voluntary messages, and then they realised that not a non-sufficient number or percentage of the population were complying with the voluntary measures, and they very quickly then turned to the authoritarian measures. So, yeah.
Walker on the back, so Tim Newburn, then Lucinda, then Liam, and then Almudena, and then Eva.
I'll try and keep it quick because there's a bunch of people on board as well. Adam, really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was perfect. It's fascinating, very thoughtful. And I do remember our conversation where you came up with both. And as you were talking, it made me think, so the general art, your narrative art was, you started with nudge. You suggested that became very messy. And you ended up with budge, which I thought very nice, very neatly was from nudge to smudge. Maybe you can have that. The one other quick observation on terminology. You started with your book title, so the nods in the direction of various classes. There's something in the water. David Altman, who was the first, whatever it was, director of the behavioural insights.
Still is.
Still is CEO, I think. His book, if I remember right, is called Hidden Wealth.
Yeah.
There's something going on. The question anyway is about time. So the political economy of behaviour. What I really liked about the talk, what I took to be the philosophy also, and I was wondering if I could just ask you to reflect a little bit more on political economy, and more particularly maybe what it was about, what is about the times, what it is about the politics and economics of late capitalism, wherever we find ourselves now, that's given rise to nudge theory and behavioural.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a big question that I would have to reflect on, because I think there's more there. I think maybe it's sort of, maybe if you'd have asked that question even 5 or 10 years ago, I could have said there was a reaction against the quite laissez-faire economic approach in the global economic system leading up to 2008, the lack of regulatory oversight. And there'd been a reaction against that particular form of political economy, that sort of Austrian school, I suppose, classic Austrian school thought, or even more laissez-faire than the Austrian version. These days, the world's so messy now, isn't it, that it's difficult for me to put a handle on that. I think, though, that there has been, I get a sense that there is a reaction against adopting paternalistic approaches, even though they are dominant in terms of the rhetoric, still within behavioural public policy. I get a sense that there is a reaction against that. And I'm not saying that that means that we should all, align with Trussian laissez-faire economics and that sort of approach. It seems to be trying to get it back in a little bit, right? But I think that there is, over the realization of that time, over the last 10 years, I think that there is a broad realization, becoming a broad realization, that the paternalistic and the externality-focused regulation, the externality-focused direction is the more appropriate way to go. And I say that also with the claim that the behavioural public the soft forms of paternalism in behavioural public policy still continue to dominate, because, as I've said, if you look at the interventions that are actually being proposed within that framework, or supposedly within that framework, they very often, usually in fact, don't match up to the parameters of that particular framework. They are often focused upon externalities. So I don't think I've answered your question at all there, Tim, but yeah, I think there's a reaction against paternalism.
Try Lucinda's question then.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think part of the question asked earlier, my question asked earlier, sorry. So I still have some challenges distinguishing clearly, but not from your explanation, perfectly clear, but actually in practice. But maybe I'll talk about that second. But so a quick question is, from your argument, I would infer that we should ban all advertising. We would you agree this is a natural continent of your argument? Because I can't remember any advertising doesn't try to play on those processes.
That's good. I mean, this is a debate between Hayek and J.K. Galbraith, which is on the causal dependence effect. I touched upon this. No, I don't think we should ban all advertising, but I do think that because this is going to be case by case, and for that reason, it's subjective and a little bit messy. But if you can identify in an exchange relationship circumstances where one party to that exchange is using the behavioural influences to manipulate the other party for that first party's self-interest, then there's a legitimate justification to consider whether we should regulate or budge against that behaviour. Now, it may be often times we decide that it's not a sufficient enough harm to warrant regulation, because regulation is harmful. It can be harmful. The side effects of regulation. So, for instance, I think I use it as an example. But say you've got, you might have a situation where you have the manufacturers of breakfast cereal using bright anthropomorphic figures to try to sell their products, right? And you could link that to behavioural science in some way. It's trying to make it more salient, jumps out on the shelf, etc., etc. For me personally, I think if I thought about that, I would say that there's not a sufficient enough harm there. It's one side of the exchange relationship trying to use tools that it can to get a product noticed in a crowded market. So for me, it's not tipped over. But there may be other instances. There might be an instance where cigarette manufacturers use bright and attractive packaging on their cigarette cases, for instance, as we now know, as we seem to now know, plain packaging perhaps reduces the incidence of people buying cigarettes than if you have colourful, attractive packaging. There, for me, has there been a significant enough interaction upon the exchange relationship? Maybe in that instance there is to justify regulation against that particular activity. So for me, it's case by case. Personally, Lucinda, I wouldn't ban all advertising, but through some kind of, I don't know what it would be, a citizen's jury or some kind of deliberation, there would be some aspects of advertising and marketing that we would regulate against.
Thanks.
So can I just say one more thing, because it can be used to mislead as well about the product. So say, for example, you go payday loan companies, they could be misleading about the pains of repaying that payday loan by not displaying or not making sufficiently enough obvious or salient the negative implications of taking out that loan, and overemphasizing the positive implications of taking out that loan. So that's strongly misleading to me. That's strongly misleading about what the product is providing.
But that's lying to make some regulation rather than using mechanisms.
Well, it could all be there. It might not be lying. It could be there. It could all be there. It could be framed in a particular way that one aspect is more salient than the other. So technically, they could say we're not lying. All the information's there, but they are using their knowledge of behavioural science to track people to particular aspects of the product.
Liam, I've noticed you there, Andrea, so you're in the queue. Liam.
Great. Really thought provoking. So I'm going to go kind of one direction that's somewhat influenced by what I've been thinking. I'm not sure how it fits in the framework, so I'd like to hear your thoughts. And so basically the idea is thinking of a different type of externality, and that's the externality of nudging itself. So part of this is influenced by the idea, so it's kind of a common idea that individual rationality can be collectively irrational. But some of this kind of evolutionary argument is that individual irrationalities can also be collectively irrational. And so you talked a lot about nudging, budging in this in terms of in instances where individuals are inducing an externality on other people. But what I'm thinking of is if individuals as a whole behave a certain way, whether that generates another externality. Right? So if you think of nudging people to invest their pensions very responsibly by putting in index funds. If everyone crowds into index funds, then you'd introduce a whole kind of externality in the system in terms of financial stability, right? So if everyone's kind of acting according to their own biases, then you have a diversified portfolio of society, right? Whereas nudging in a certain direction can effectively undiversify society in certain ways. And that lack of diversity has like a pretty negative externality in terms of financial stability, robustness, however you want to call it. And so in that case, like, even if I have the individual freedom to not accept the nudge is imposing an externality on me due to my general exposure to the stability of the financial system. And so even if I'm not invested in stocks, this spills over into bond yields, into mortgage affordability, all this kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering in this context, is like nudging only acceptable if it's ineffective, such that it doesn't move enough people, or how do you deal with these potential aspects of nudging?
Well, personally, I don't think that's a nudge, because you're talking about externalities automatically. So I don't think I suppose you're saying that it goes back, it benefits everybody, and then it ultimately could benefit me. Maybe, there'd be an externality and internality. I would only support what you're saying, I think, Leon. Personally, I'm not saying that everybody, this is my view, of course, right? I would support that if the action that you are encouraging people to do at an individual level is not particularly costly for them, or you might consider it to be not particularly costly. It doesn't have to be financially costly. It could be, costs on their autonomy. Basically what they do or don't want to do. Right? Now, I'll use a different example, right, to try to illustrate this point. Right? So, and I think you could relate it across to your example about the stability of financial markets. But say the common example of where you're trying to get people to register as an organ donor. Right? Often it's been argued that if you have a system of presumed consent, people have to opt in to be on the organ donor registration list. Sorry, people have to opt out to be off the organ donor registration list. You'll get far more people as a percentage of the population on the list than if they have to opt in and say, I want to be on this list. Right? So that's a fact. You do get lots. You get difference between 25%, 25% of the population, 85% of the population on the lists. And that's been often put forward as a nudge. I don't think that's a nudge. It's a regulation for one thing, and it's focused upon externalities for another thing. You're basically trying to get people to do something that's the benefit of other people. Right? So in that instance, after thinking about this a lot, I personally don't think for most people it's hugely costly for them to be automatically enrolled on the list. And if they really don't want to be on the organ donor list, they can deregister. There is a cost there, and a lot of people are resistant to doing that. For me personally, as a population national level, and for the possible benefits that intervention could have for the population as a whole, I would say, let's change that default personally, right? And we have changed that default in this country. That's something that you've got the individuals to do, according to findings of behavioural science, that benefits society as a whole. If, however, and it might be the case, and I might change my view on this, if a significant number of people said, hold on a minute, this is costly to me. I don't want to be on this list. Firstly, I didn't even know I was on the list. Now I'm on this list. I don't want to go make my organs too. If I am on the list, I've got to run around and find a time in my day where I've got to deregister for this particular thing. The automatic default is for me not to do anything, and therefore you shouldn't change the automatic default for something that you want me to do. If enough people said that, I would say, hold on a minute, this is sufficiently costly for a significant number of people to forego the societal benefits that we would get from most of them registering, through presumed consent. So it would just depend for me. In that instance, what you're talking about there, I, for instance, would have to think and see how costly it is for those individuals themselves and how many of those individuals themselves, in order for us to improve that kind of what you're essentially arguing is a sort of collective good. So, yeah. Maybe is my answer.
Thank you. Almudena, then Eva, then Andrea, and I.
Thank you, Adam. I kept picking
right?
Yeah.
Whether it was feed people or let, you know, protect yourself, you know.
Yeah.
So I kept thinking then, what is it special about behavioral public policy or behavioral interventions? And to me, it's always been about intervention, or whether it's a you know, a regulation. It's about that behavior and deviating from rationality and then implementing a policy, whatever form or shape or motivation that policy has. Am I wrong?
I know.
I'm confused.
I love these questions. I mean, you do have to. I mean, I've tried to be very careful in the book to say that my whole approach is focused on behavioural public policy, which is a subfield of public policy. So, of course, you get a lot of the broader public policy arguments enter into the discussion. But ultimately, if it's not using, in some sense, the findings of behavioural science or behavioural economics, the systematic findings, the affects, the heuristics, then it's not behavioural policy, right? So, yeah, I mean, so for instance, the budge, maybe this will make it clearer again for Lucinda, it's not quite clear. I think what she said, you weren't quite clear about what a budge is. Mostly for me, a budge is about trying to remove unacceptable manipulation from an exchange relationship. Right? So if you went back to Adam Smith, we believe very strongly that the market was the most appropriate thing to do, right, to have. Think about the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. You have these artisans that are selling each other's products to each other. And he's saying that you don't have to rely upon any sense of altruism. Each of them are exchanging out their own self-interest, and you get some kind of optimal solution about, you know, the amount of goods that each person holds. There's no manipulation. They're very simple artisans. They're all self-employees there as well. Self-employed. So there's no indication there that they're acting out of self-interest to benefit the group. And by doing that, they're benefiting the group, and they're benefiting the individuals themselves. That's almost like a classic version of reciprocity. But to me, over the 19th century, and what Adam Smith didn't completely foresee, or J.S. Mill foresee, is the potential in this aspect for parties in exchange relationships to manipulate other parties according to these findings of behavioral science, because they didn't know about these aspects of behavioral science. And of course, exchange partners got much more sophisticated and larger, driven with asymmetries of information and the potential to exploit the behavioral effects than the butcher, the breaker, and the brewer, right? Much, much bigger. So for me, there, we focus upon where the some exchange partners are using these behavioral influences to in essence manipulate another party to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, because it's in the self-interest of that first party. So the behavioral science is very much in, and there we can regulate. According to the rules of behavioral public policy. A more traditional aspect, and the more traditional conception of externalities, of course, in economics is that it's not this externality in the direct exchange relationship between two parties. When two parties are doing something and they're exposing externalities on another party, right? So pollution, for instance, is harming another party. Now, you might regulate against that in many instances, but to me, there's no behavioral aspect to that. That's a tool of public policy. We've got to consider whether the externality is significant enough in order to regulate that relationship between these parties, or regulate one of the two parties. That's behavior. That's public policy more generally defined. There's no behavioral. So that's the distinction to me when you're regulating around externalities between the exchange relationship versus when you're considering externalities to a third party. Does that make? I mean, I've been thinking about these things for 10 years, right? So it's,
I think that if what you're talking about is the transactions between two parties.
Yeah.
If there is a behavioral aspect that allows one party to take out the other, that's all within the market system. So that's not, so from a society
Which means that it's not in the market. I mean, the embrace of the market system by the Austrians or by Adam Smith or David Hume and all these guys that supported a market mechanism. There was no assumption embedded in that one party would be manipulating the other party with the behavioural influences. So that's a new approach devised mainly by me, really, because we've become aware that people can do that. People can use these behavioural affects to manipulate other parties.
So Eva and then Andrea.
Thanks. I look forward to reading the book. So I'm going to ask about the difference to public policy. Can I ask if you can summarize with the sentence then what's the difference between behavioral economics for public policy and behavioral public policy? Like I understand you mentioned that, for example, it comes to errors or biases, you prefer to call them inconsistencies. I guess I understand that's an important difference.
It's part of it, yeah.
But aren't both basically trying to achieve the same, to nudge
There's
people
commonalities between those approaches. Other people have asked me about this actually, and I train. I did my PhD in behavioural economics, so I come out of behavioural economics tradition that combines psychology and economics essentially. And what they call the behavioural welfare economists, people like Doug Bernstein, what's his name? Doug Bernheim. They have a group that are very much focused upon, I think, what you're calling behavioural economics for policy there. And they try to use behavioural economics to work within the sort of the models of mainstream economic theory and to relax those sorts of assumptions around that. And that I think that is what I think that's almost like a subfield of behavioural public policy, because with behavioural public policy, it's gone far beyond economics and psychology. Behavioural public policy tries to involve behavioural scientists or people with a behavioural interest from every conceivable social science, some of the natural sciences and the humanities as well. So we involve animal behaviouralists, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, economists, philosophers, you name it. They've all got an input into this. So it goes broader, I think, and I think it probably goes possibly deeper as well than just the traditional behavioural economics applications to standard economic models. I think that's right.
So Andrea and then Burkai's got the last question. So Andrea, please.
Okay, thanks, Adam. As always, great to hear your thoughts on this. I was thinking about, what do you think about the argument that the reason for the soft paternalism to exist is the fact that to detect when the behavior changes, where the person generates internalities, that's one thing, and it's very hard to detect that, but it's easy to detect when the externalities are created. So from the policymaker's perspective, they are literally just preventing people from developing those externalities by focusing on internalities as a preventive measure.
If they are doing that, it's a strange way of going about it, I think. I mean, Thaler and Sunstein argue that you can detect internalities just by doing surveys. So if you go to smokers and you say, do you want to stop smoking? And most smokers say, yeah, I want to stop smoking. They say that deliberatively, most smokers want to stop smoking. But to me, there's all sorts of problems with those sorts of surveys. You know, it might be that the smokers are just answering in the way that they think the interviewer wants to hear. They're not considering in that moment all of the negative implications for them of stopping smoking, etc., etc. So I think it's much more. I think it is philosophically very, very difficult to get at deliberative preferences anyway, and that's another reason why I think we shouldn't be adopting the nudge approach. Maybe it's similar to what we pointed out. It's just easier to identify externalities as well. The argument than internalities.
Thank you, Burkai.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I'm also fascinated by the talk, and I also appreciated a lot the overlapping key themes of last week's talk and this week's talk. Made me think a lot about a few things that comes across as generally in behavioral science that when I was being trained, one of the major criticisms outsiders for the behavioral public policy, behavioral economics in general is become first non-cumulative, second contextless, and free from existing structures in this development. So power structures, hierarchies, and other things that all constrained all these relationships that policy makers stay kind of like a neutral space where they are not the ego in making these relationships. And it's very hard to understand these things free from structures. And I was wondering, like, where do you stand in that case? Like,
Well, I always say, I mean, the two-word essence, and this might seem obvious for a broader social science, but it goes against standard economic theory. The two-word essence of behavioral public policy is context matters. And these go to either and Tim's questions a little bit linked. I'll try to link them because my answers I think have not been great, so I'll try to finish on a high note, right? And structure, sociology, structure anthropologies as well. That's why I think that having a much deeper and richer understanding of the other social sciences takes behavioral public policy beyond behavioral economics or policy or behavioral welfare economics. That's one thing. Adam infusing and context matters. So Tim mentioned in the US, if he's right there, that Americans were not so accepting of wearing masks as other countries. Context matters, right? Because I'll just finish with, I mean, there's a famous study by the Behavioural Insights team where they introduced, for one area of the country in the Southwest, they sent out letters to try to get people to pay their taxes on time. And it said on the letter, something like 9 out of 10 people in your local area pay their taxes on time. With that one shot, they increase quite significantly the number of people in that region over that 1 year paying their taxes on time. We don't know how sustained that effect would be, but in that one shot, well, listen, well, the 9 out of 10, well, yeah, well, that's another matter. They introduced exactly the same intervention in America. Can't remember where, it must be New Jersey, but somewhere in America. And it had zero effect in America, right? So context matters, That's a rich debate. I apologise for my answers to the questions.
No, we're finishing on a high note. Thanks very much, Adam. That was really interesting interpretive question.